events in our Afghanistan Speakers Series. This is the inaugural event, but we do anticipate hosting a number of events this year on a similar theme. So, for example, next week, we are inviting on the campus Dr. Thomas Barfield of Boston University, who will speak on the British and the Soviet experiences in Afghanistan and use that as a springboard to comment on the current conflict. Next semester, we hope to have on campus one of the former Afghan ambassadors to the United States. We're still looking to confirm that. And we may host a debate as well on the future of the U.S. role in Afghanistan as America's longest war continues to go on. But I can think of no better way to inaugurate this year of events than with our speaker today, Dean Steve Coll. Steve Coll is currently the Dean of Columbia University's School of Journalism. That's a position he earned through 2 decades of work as a reporter for the Washington Post, and then another decade of work with the New Yorker magazine. Steve Coll was a foreign correspondent based in India in the early 90s. He reported on Afghanistan and Pakistan throughout the 90s, which is what led to his signature work, Ghost Wars, subtitled The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and Bin Laden from the Soviet invasion to September 10, 2001. And usually when you see something that says The Secret History, you shouldn't trust it. But in this case, I recommend that you do. The back says the CIA itself would be hard to beat his grasp of global events, deeply satisfying. As it happens, I worked in the CIA. I sat at the Afghanistan and Pakistan desk for a number of years, and when I was training new analysts, I required them to read this book. So that gives you a sense of how highly I value it, and I think the CIA and anyone involved in foreign affairs and national defense recognizes this book is high quality. And indeed, it was for this book that he won his second Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism, actually for nonfiction, this one. So we are privileged to have Steve Coll talk to us today about the war in Afghanistan and al-Qaeda. Please join me in welcoming Steve Coll.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks very much for the invitation to come back to you today and see some friends in the audience, Larry, Harvey, an old colleague from the Washington Post. We're together for about 90 minutes, but I'm not going to talk for anything like that long. I'd love to start taking your questions fairly soon, but I'll talk now for a little while. And when we open it up and Paul comes back, feel free to ask about anything. We can range across your curiosity beyond Afghanistan and Pakistan. But what I'm going to try to do is set the news of this week, which has been kind of grim, into a much wider context, partly grounded in my own experience of someone who's been traveling back and forth to Afghanistan for something like 25 or more years now. And then to try to, in the middle of the talk, offer some notes on what I think are some of the big recurring themes in our struggle to create a stable government and security situation in Afghanistan. These are really notes on a work in progress, quite literally, because my main project these days is I'm writing a second volume of both those words that Paul's going to refer to. I've started writing it, but I've still got another year or more to go before I finish it. And some of those of you who do this sort of work know that while you're in the middle of something on the page, you're struggling to try to both tell a story and get the words down in a readable way, but also to think a little bit about what is at issue here, and to step back from time to time and try to sketch a sense of theme and context. And so I'm in the middle of that, and I'm not quite sure yet everything about what I think, but I'll share some notes on what I think are some of the big questions, both from 2001 until the present, but also, maybe more importantly, looking ahead at the next 5 years, which are going to be, I think, very challenging. So let me just start, if I can, on a little bit of a personal note, just to get everyone oriented to where I come from on this. So I encountered Afghanistan almost entirely by accident. I was a foreign correspondent at the Washington Post. I was a young reporter at the Washington Post. I got started doing investigative reporting about financial crime on Wall Street, and then I very much wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And the way the system worked was you couldn't say where you wanted to go. It was kind of competitive internally. You just had to apply, and if you got selected, you went where they sent you. And I got sent to India in 1989, and my beat was India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh. So rather large territory, a fair amount of news. And at the Washington Post in those days, Afghanistan and Pakistan were really the priorities. That was the signal I got when I went out. You know, India is important, but this is a Washington story right now. And the reason was that the Soviet Union had formally withdrawn from Afghanistan in February of 1989. I arrived a few months later. But they left behind a client government and about 4,000 advisors, if that sounds familiar, to try to shore up that government. And not all of those advisors were declared, but that was the best estimate of how many were there. And the client government, remember the 1989, so the Berlin Wall falls in November, the Soviet Union is still around for another few more years. And so the government in Kabul was run by this guy, President Najibullah, who was an old secret police chief and a guy with a lot of blood on his hands, but a very tough and savvy political strongman of the kind of Ba'ath Party tradition. And his government, with this Soviet support and advisors and financial flows and subsidies, big air bridge that flew in every day, circling these big Aleutian transport jets circling down into the airport at Kabul, sending off flares to try to distract American Stinger missiles that the Mujahideen had. It was hanging in there. And they basically owned a footprint in Afghanistan very similar to what the Ghani Abdullah government owns today. They had a big archipelago of cities and a few transport links during the day, not a lot during the night, and there were large sections of the countryside that they just didn't control at all. And the US-backed rebels were pressing on cities and towns. And this week when I was watching the news in Kunduz, I went back and saw someone had posted a story that was published in 1990 or 91 when Kunduz fell to the rebels the first time around in the same circumstances. But the way we worked as reporters was there were basically two sides of the war. There was the rebel side that was based in Pakistan, and then there was the government side that was located in Kabul, backed by the Soviet Union. And we could travel to both sides of the war, but you had to do it in different ways. So you could go to Kabul on Afghan Ariana Airlines from Delhi, fly into Kabul, and then you could go visit with President Najibullah, and he would sit around a table in the foreign ministry and pound his fist on the desk and say, Americans, you have it all wrong. After me comes Islamic extremism. Where Cold War is ending, you know, we should be partners in stabilizing this political transition. The U.S. policy at that time was highly suspicious still of Moscow and unwilling to consider engaging with Najibullah as a political partner. So the press was basically all he had to try to get his message out. But the more remarkable thing in light of today's events and the threats that Afghans face is that, of course, Kabul at that time was a secular city on the principles of Soviet communism. So when you came out of the airport, there were tens of thousands of women in skirts and high heels going to work in Afghan ministries. You know, their fashions were by way of Prague and Budapest, sort of Eastern European influenced. But the number of women in the workforce and the number of girls in high school was you know, really quite significant. And part of the way that the Najibullah minders, because you were still a reporter in a police state, so you were always being kind of shepherded around. One of the ways they would try to get their message across, if it was a handful of Western journalists who were interested in going to Kabul in those years, because there were much bigger stories elsewhere in Tiananmen and in Eastern Europe, Central Europe. But you'd go with a Le Monde reporter or someone else, and they'd take you out to some high school, girls' high school, and you would ask to be the guest speaker here are a couple of representatives from the running dog capitalist societies that are going to condemn you to Islamic extremism in a few years. Do you have any questions for them? And they usually pop their hands up and say, yes, why are you backing Mubarak Hekmatyar? Because when he comes into Kabul, my life is going to change, and I'm not going to be able to go to school anymore. And that was the tenor of their messaging, rooted in some truth, but obviously covering up a lot of other complicated truths about the Soviet occupation and brutality during their experience in Afghanistan. But I'll come back to that because that moment of jeopardy in those lives, and particularly vivid, are the memories of these professional women and high school girls that we encountered in those years. There's something like that going on, I'm afraid, in Afghan cities right now. I think, over the last few years, there's been a lot of dark predictions about Afghanistan's future in the West from a distance. And my experience of traveling to Kabul has been more mixed, that there was still a fair amount of resilience and a lot of change in Afghan cities that gave rise to some hope that this transition might be managed on Afghan terms more successfully than the Soviet transition was. And my sense over the last 3 months or so, from meeting Afghans visiting from Kabul and from just being in touch with people who are there, is that this time feels a little bit different. It's a little darker. People are packing up and going. A lot of young people are taking risks to travel and migrate into Europe who weren't taking those risks a year or two ago. And there's a real worry that the paralysis that's so obvious in the government and the kind of stasis inside the military that has not led to coherence in the military campaign, yet the lack of a proper Minister of Defense, never mind proper command system all the way down, is creating real vulnerability. I think there are a couple of other sort of aspects of the present day that just this week that seem a little too familiar and worrisome. The strike on the hospital in Kunduz, brings back to everyone's consciousness this recurrent problem that the United States has had in military operations in Afghanistan, managing close air support in a way that's strategically sustainable. And it's a very tough equation. I'm sure there are people here who have fought it on the ground and know what it's about. But there was a period when the Taliban revival began in 2006, 2007, when Hamid Karzai attracted a lot of attention in the United States for complaining about aspects of U.S. military operations, particularly direct raids on rural villages in the south and east, and also recurrent mistakes that occurred while carrying out close air support. And one element of that was just that the military force that we had on the ground at that time was so under-resourced compared to the scale of the country and the mission, that you inevitably got these small units, very bravely going out on these long reconnaissance, armed reconnaissance missions or raids of one sort or another, and they'd get stuck out there and something would turn the wrong way, and essentially the solution was close air support. So we kept a combined air operations command center in Qatar that could deliver an aircraft any place in Afghanistan within 30 minutes of a 911 call. That was our standard. So we were constantly, taking advantage of this enormous air superiority to deliver decisive tactical effects spread out across this very large and carved-up country with military units that were relatively small. And the problem is that, if that's your solution to every one of these crises, you're going to end up making the kinds of mistakes that we saw this week. And the strategic effect of that, the more time went on, and the more kind of our welcome became stretched in Afghanistan. more that matter. And so this is, again, in the transition, a challenge of how is it that if we do keep 5 or 10,000 forces there, how do you break this pattern? Because it does recur for a reason. It's not just random accidents, it's structural, is what I'm trying to say. The more important problem is Afghan politics. I think there's been a recognition, a little late in coming in the Obama administration after the counterinsurgency, expeditionary counterinsurgency campaign, that no matter what you think of counterinsurgency theory and doctrine, in the end, the political transition in Kabul mattered enormously, and not much attention had been paid to it, and there was a limit to what the international community could accomplish. Nonetheless, there was a commitment to this presidential election and a hope that a post-Karzai government could emerge that would allow for this transition in military operations and in the building of Afghan security forces to succeed. Well, last winter, the new government, the leaders of the new government came to Washington for what in the State Department, I think they call it flags and flowers kind of visit to show that this government was unified and on message and grateful to the United States for the sacrifices that it made and the investments they continue to make. And so there was a dinner at the State Department to celebrate the new government, and like a lot of hundreds of other Afghan hanger-arounders, I was invited and I went down. And of course it was the strangest state dinner I've ever heard of, because you had two chief executives on the stage with John Kerry standing in between them. You had President Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah, and they were both represented by protocol as kind of the co-government of Afghanistan. It's a little bit unusual to have two leaders in a state dinner like that. And then there was also the fact that they didn't much care for each other and they weren't cooperating in the formation of the new government. And so they had been out at Camp David having a little retreat all day, I think, to try to build a little more camaraderie and cooperation. And the Secretary of State was in the position of essentially saying, and we had a great time today, didn't we guys, at Camp David? And wasn't that a funny joke that Ashraf Ghani told Chief Executive Abdullah? You laughed, didn't you? And I thought this is bad. This is not really sustainable. And so these are all the reasons why inside the government of the United States these days, and the kind of analytical forecasting and classified analysis that Paul used to participate in, the forecasts are really quite negative. So the prediction of the analysts in the shops where people like Paul used to work is that this government won't hold, and that it will crumble, and the Taliban will retake power, most likely, at some point over the next 3 or 4 years. So that's the consensus forecast, I think, and not just in this government, but in Europe and in Pakistan in a way that I'll come back to. But is it right? So when you go back to 1989, when I first started traveling out there without really any idea of what was around me except what I could see for myself and hear in interviews, it was also the case that the United States was forecasting that the Najibullah government would collapse within weeks. I think 6 weeks was at one point the forecast that the Central Intelligence Agency issued to decision makers about how fast this cookie would crumble. And in fact, it did not fall. It stayed intact until the Soviet Union ended. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, the subsidies stopped, the air bridge stopped, and everyone could see at that point that the game was up. And at that point, Kabul did fall to the rebels in April of '92 on a very memorable Saturday for those of us who were there. The Mujahideen walked in from the countryside with their long beards and their AKs, and all of these secular Kabul residents who had been warned about this day and dreading it for years and years, the police basically all took off their uniforms and went home. and started growing their beards, and the women disappeared from the streets. There was a little bit of hopefulness for about 24 hours. People put flowers in barrels of guns and celebrated Liberation Day. And that night, people were firing their tracer bullets in the air in celebration. And as the hours went on, you could see that the trajectory was flattening down, and the civil war had started by the next morning, basically to capture key buildings in Kabul. But the point is that Kabul didn't actually crumble. The Soviet Union crumbled and then Kabul fell. The Mujahideen were making very slow progress in taking back the kinds of cities that they were attacking, the Kunduses of the world. They took Bardez, they took Kunduz, but they really could not make a lot of progress. And Kabul still had a 25-kilometer, pretty much impregnable perimeter, even more impregnable than Kabul was today, because we didn't have suicide truck bombings or anything like this in the case that you get now. So they weren't even letting the ones and twos in. The security regime was so strong. And so I don't take it for granted that the forecast is truth. These forecasts have lots of sources of bias and kind of incentive built into them inside the national security system. There's not a lot of penalty for being wrong about being gloomy sometimes. So I don't know. I do want to say two things that are more hopeful that are also present in Kabul right now. So one is there is a population in the cities of Afghanistan now that has really no precedent in the country's history. It is very young and it is very wired into the rest of the world. There has never been a youth population of this size as a percentage of the population or just in absolute numbers. And certainly not one that's so well connected. Now, there's a school of thought, now what does this population want? What will it fight for? How will it deal with the threat of the Taliban? What will it mobilize to defend? How long will it endure the kinds of rates of casualties that the security forces and the police are enduring now? These are questions that I can't answer, but I do know that this population in the last 2 or 3 or 4 years has changed the character of Afghanistan in significant ways, written a new narrative of nationalism, connected the country to the outside world in a way that has never been connected before, and informed Afghan identity, which is a very strong and powerful and intact source of nationalism, with a new energy. And they can't all get on buses to Iran, Turkey, and Greece, and not all of them are doing so. Now, there is a kind of hypothesis in the West that this youth population is almost all a positive force and should be understood as a source of deep resilience. I'm not so sure. I think if you look on college campuses in Afghanistan right now, a lot of extreme parties have organized students. The trouble in the 70s started at Kabul University in very politicized student union populations, both left and Islamist. And so not all of the organized Afghan youth are necessarily going to mobilize to defend this government or defend values that we would share, but they are something new, I think is the first thing I could say. And then the second observation that I think it's important to include in any assessment is there is a little bit of the dog that hasn't barked in Afghanistan right now politically. Think about that bizarre scene at the state dinner, at least as I experienced it. And consider that there really is not a functioning government of national unity. It's much more like chronic problems of Lebanon's cabinet formation. Could go on for a long time, same as with in Iraq. And the divisions, largely between North and South and East, but much more complicated than that. The factionalism that's represented by this split verdict in the election and fraud and the final agreement to share power or try to. Within that, there has been a remarkable amount of stability. That there has been, nobody has mobilized their youth to throw rocks at the other side. Nobody has attempted a coup yet. Maybe last summer there was a little bit of an attempt, but it was put down before it could get very far. And there is a kind of a self-interest that explains this resilience. You have interlocking elites in Kabul and in the major cities, families, sons, in business, in NGOs, in government, connected to the region, to Central Asia, and Kabul International Airport is the door through which all of the international support that makes this consensus viable pours, and nobody has an interest in turning the switch that makes it no longer viable to share prosperity, to share access to international resources, and to keep the streets as relatively stable as they are. You know, for all of the dark images from Kunduz this week, and for the, even though there was a couple of car bombings in southwest Kabul yesterday, Kabul is not at war. I mean, it's not in a state of violent crisis. Certainly nothing like what we knew in '92 or '93 or '94. And so there is a kind of deep resilience that's very difficult for outsiders to map in Afghanistan. I think, once in a while, in chronicling this history of the Obama administration's efforts to get a grip on Afghan policy, you encounter an expert who would say something like, in the middle of some interagency meeting, if our policy requires us to understand Afghan family, tribal, regional networks, if that's what's required for us to succeed, we might as well just stop, because we're never going to understand the kind of texture of this webbing with the level of fidelity required to influence it. And so when I think of the dog that doesn't bark, I think that there is a webbing there that is very difficult for us to measure or assess. And it'll be tested now over the next 2 years. Okay. So, notes on a work in progress. So this history that I'm writing kind of starts where the last one ended, which ended on September 10th, 2001, and that book started with the Soviet invasion roughly late 1979 and came forward to September 10th. So this research that I've been working on really since 2008 or 2009, so it's been about 7 years. I've been trying to build notes for this volume. Starts essentially on September 11th or September 10th, and comes forward to something like the present day. I'm not quite sure about the ending yet. But I've been trying to think about what are, and I encounter in the details, in the interview notes, in the notes of records of meetings that I can access and other sort of bodies of research, I encounter certain recurring themes that I'm not quite sure yet how to work with them fully, but I'm coming closer to an understanding about where they fit. And I just thought I would mention a few of them as a kind of reader's guide to the headlines over the next few years, because I think they're still present in the current dilemmas. So one of them is embedded in the title of this talk, Afghanistan and al-Qaeda, I think it was sort of the subhead. And it's really remarkable and complicated how, from the very beginning of our decision to attack al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in October of 2001, and to seek the destruction of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as the Taliban called themselves. From the very beginning of that, of Operation Enduring Freedom up until today, the way that al-Qaeda on the one hand and the Taliban on the other hand have figured in our thinking and in our policy and in our resourcing of this conflict have been in continuous forms of tension with one another. Now I will spare you all of the chapters of this history, but I'll mention a few examples. So, in the fall of 2001, there was a fairly straightforward call and response with the Taliban about their decision to harbor al-Qaeda leaders in Afghanistan. So it was, we don't want to go to war with you necessarily. We don't have a quarrel with you. We don't see any Afghans on these airplanes. We don't see any Afghans in the plotting. We don't see any Afghans in the financing of this by and large, other than the Taliban sanctuary that al-Qaeda took advantage of. So we don't have a quarrel with you. Turn these guys over, and we'll figure out what comes next between us. Taliban say, interesting idea, we're not interested. Okay, last chance, we're coming, no, we're not interested. And Mullah Omar made that decision himself. The Taliban have more or less documented their internal debates. You know, they don't keep great minutes, so you only get kind of selective oral histories, and it's, sometimes I think the history of the internal Taliban debate about whether to follow Mullah Omar down this suicidal path, it's a little bit influenced by the people who are on one side of the debate, but because they're the ones who talk to people that I can access. But by and large, there was a little bit of a debate inside. Are you really sure, boss, you want to do this? And he kept saying, actually, I don't think they're going to attack. And they'd say, yeah, I think they really are going to attack. And he'd say, well, then it's God's will, and that means that we just have to accept what comes and learn from it. And if we're destined to be expelled from power, that means that God has essentially sent us into the wilderness to figure out how to do it better, because we obviously are being punished for our failures. That was essentially his argument as described by his colleague. But after the war unfolded so successfully and so rapidly, there was a kind of that moment of de-Ba'athification and post-Nazi reconciliation where there was another bite at the apple. So what do we do now that the Taliban have managed to essentially abandon Afghanistan? What kind of a political reconstruction policy do we want to pursue? And again, we really did not have the bandwidth for that question. Some of it was just visceral. These guys are on the wrong side of this enduring conflict. Some of it was really just a lack of understanding of how the Taliban functions inside Pashtun communities in the south and the east, and what the different forms of blending were between the kind of Kandahari leadership and the kind of eastern, half-connected Taliban flag-waving types. Anyway, we did not adopt a policy in politics at that time other than the bond process, which excluded the Taliban, and most of the people involved in the bond process, very thoughtful experts, Zal Khalilzad and Dr. Rahimi, the Algerian diplomat, and Jim Dobbins, who's done a couple of different tours. They all say now, okay, we should have seen that we needed to do more to build a political transition. But hindsight is easier than decision making. I think the two other things I wanted to mention about this kind of dilemma of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. So one is how Afghanistan and Afghan stability figured across different chapters of policymaking. So post 9/11, post 2001, so post December 2001, then the last couple of years of the Bush administration, when the Taliban revival caused the administration to look back and try to think about how do you resource this problem after a period of concentrating on Iraq and neglecting Afghanistan. And then again, during the Obama administration's first policy review in the spring of 2009, and then again in the second policy review in the autumn of 2009, and then again when, during the middle of the counterinsurgency, the Obama administration decided to try to negotiate a strategic kind of reconciliation with Taliban leadership. kind of a Northern Ireland style exit plan. And at each of those chapters, I think, this is notes on a work in progress, so I may not say this quite right, I'm still thinking about it. But there was always a way in which Afghanistan was the tail and Pakistan was the dog in the assumptions about what mattered most. And if you're a national security type in the administration, you understand why that constantly occurred. So, Pakistan is a country of 190 million people. It has 100 plus nuclear weapons. Afghanistan is a country of 30 million people, and it's the fourth poorest country in the world at best. And it has poses no threat other than as a sanctuary to anyone basically but itself. So if you're trying to visualize a 10 or 20-year outcome to your policy decision, you're trying to rationalize putting Americans in harm's way to achieve some effect. There are some principles that are fairly easy to operate on. One is, where is al-Qaeda? Wherever they are, we're going there. Okay, so where is al-Qaeda? Well, al-Qaeda is in Pakistan, by and large, after 2002. I mean, by the time you get to 2009, 2010, if there were 100 people that you could fairly label al-Qaeda in Afghanistan scattered around in groups, that was probably on the hot side at that point. And most of them, were likely Uzbeks or other Central Asians who had signed up in some way or another. Al-Qaeda was in Waziristan, Al-Qaeda was in Karachi, Al-Qaeda was in Rawalpindi, but it wasn't in Afghanistan. So that was a political military problem that never really changed and never really was resolved. So the idea was always, we need to be in Afghanistan because we don't want it to be a sanctuary again. It's also a platform from which we can address the Pakistan problem. At the same time, we're going to fly into Islamabad and give everybody a big bear hug at General Headquarters in Rawalpindi and get the Army and ISI to go after al-Qaeda, because after all, we have a shared interest, don't we, in suppressing these groups that are certainly by 2009 wreaking havoc in Pakistani cities as well. So the hypothesis always had this kind of very rational kind of construct around it, but it failed repeatedly, and it's still failing. And the reason is just located in Pakistan's kind of strategic design and their interests. At various points during the Obama administration, it was sort of the explicit policy of the administration to try to persuade Pakistan to change its strategic calculus. That was the phrase that was often used. That is, to persuade the Pakistanis that they would be better off if they stopped harboring Islamist groups like the Taliban, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and related groups, including al-Qaeda. That they would get more benefits and more security from abandoning that 30 or 40-year-old policy than if they didn't. But the effort to persuade the Pakistanis to make that big change would have been a very big departure from the policy, the strategic design that the Army certainly has perceived for such a long time, going back to the 70s. There were very few sticks and a lot of carrots, so it was mostly about visions of strategic partnership, water supplies, energy supplies, major non-NATO ally, lots of big weapon systems, and yet at the same time we didn't trust them enough to actually give them everything that they wanted or had asked for. So there was this currency of, well, if you prove to us that you're a reliable partner, then we'll give you a little bit more than the year before. And I'm not here to say that it was a terrible idea to try to persuade the Pakistanis to come to a different vision of their own national interests, but it is easy to say that it didn't work and that it was hindered by internal contradictions in the way we went about it, because we were both embracing them with a big bear hug and attacking them unilaterally at the same time, and they understood that, and so they were kind of unpersuaded about our intentions. But I think when I look back at the history of the period between 2001 and 2008, the one turning point that seems so clear in the facts on the ground is really more like 2005 and 2006, when it does seem that we don't have a lot of hard evidence. There is a little bit of evidence that's very explicit. Around 2006, General Musharraf, who was a partner of the United States and had great deep affection for George W. Bush, who President Bush invested a lot of effort in the relationship and was very successful in building a one-on-one relationship with both him and Karzai. And around that time, in 2006, I think Musharraf and the highest-ranking officers in the Pakistan Army concluded that the United States had made a strategic decision to partner with India for the next 10 or 20 years. And the specific evidence that they saw was the nuclear deal that we cut with India and our refusal to give them a similar deal. And they also looked at the simultaneous decision that we made to encourage NATO countries to take the lead in providing sort of peace enforcement, peacekeeping in the south and east, so that we could concentrate our forces in Iraq, which at that time was going from bad to worse. And so essentially the Pakistani High Command, I think rather coldly, not with a lot of emotion or fever, essentially looked at it and they said, India is the U.S.'s partner for the next 20 years, we're not. And the U.S. is going home, just as we thought they would. And they're giving this over to the Dutch. So we might as well get ready to defend our western borders and our interests in Afghanistan, just as we've always had to do. They did this to us in the 90s, and the Taliban were our instrument then, and they're going to be our instrument now. And the only difference was, and whatever aid we give to them, it has to be passive enough so that we can't get busted in the court of international opinion and end up being heavily sanctioned or otherwise delegitimized. So there's a clear turn in their policy of support and sanctuary. It's not just that the Taliban are spontaneously rising in 2005 and 2006 out of some disgust with kleptomania in Kabul, because after all, Karzai's re-election in late 2004, the parliamentary elections in 2005 were quite successful political events in Afghan eyes, and that actually made the urgency of Pakistan's need to figure out a plan B a little bit greater, I think. So that design, which really you could trace back to the 1970s, and you could pitch it forward to today, is something that is very easy to encounter in Rawalpindi, even in the last couple or 3 years. So while I was working on this book, I would go out to Pakistan once or twice a year, and I was fortunate to have access to, serving Army officers of significance. And I would sit down with them and say, well, so usually I'd ask them the history, what were you thinking here or there? And then we turn to the present day and the future. And I would say that I heard the very consistent forecast from them. Again, their record of accuracy is no better than anyone else's, maybe a little bit worse, but essentially they were operating under a forecast, a national forecast, and their forecast was, you're not going to succeed in building an Afghan national army. You are overreaching. Your numbers are too high. You don't have the congressional support to pay these salaries. They are not coherent enough to carry and lead an Afghan army of 300,000 men without fracturing. They don't have the NCO culture. They don't have the leadership. They're riven internally. And besides, you won't write the checks for long enough for this to gel. So you are on a fool's errand. And the problem is, when that army falls apart, it's going to be right on our doorstep. So we are preparing for that day. That day is coming. And then you'd say, well, when? And they'd say, usually, our forecast is it's going to happen between 2016 and 2018. And so we've got some time, essentially, to push our western frontier forward and to prepare for political competition in post-American Afghanistan, which is something we've been, practiced at for some time. So you keep telling us to go whack the Haqqanis in North Waziristan, and essentially, without being so explicit, their message is, why would we do that? This is our forward strategy. It has always been our forward strategy, and your strategy is failing in plain sight. It's not going to work, so we're going to essentially preempt it. Now, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I have to say that has been very consistently articulated in private for 3 or 4 years. So if Afghanistan is going to defeat that design, that strategic design, if Afghanistan and the international community are going to defeat that strategic design, it has to start with the recognition that that's what's going on, and also it has to start with some humility about what our capacity is to create these structures and manage them on such a short timeline. So where does that leave us now? And I'll finish and we can turn to your questions. I mentioned the experience I had as a young correspondent going into Kabul in those years and going into these high schools and seeing all these, getting to know families where a lot of women were in the workforce and a lot of young women had ambitions for themselves. And I remember all too well how fast that population just disappeared. It vanished in a period of 6 months from the time that Mujahideen walked into Kabul until the time of the Civil War took hold and the Taliban rose. I mean, by 1996, the Taliban controlled virtually every city except the Tsar in the north and the Panjshir Valley. But they in Jalalabad and in Kabul, in places where this generation had come of age. And I sometimes sobered by the observation that even though I have a conviction of what I told you about this generation of Afghan youth being without precedent in the country's history, I think in 1992, in January of 1992, I might have said the same thing about the urban generation that had come of age in the last years of the Soviet, and they vanished. They vanished into refugee camps, they went into their homes, they shut down, they escaped to the former Soviet Union, they went abroad, but it was over in a flash. And so I think it's a challenge to an honorable government with the resources of ours to think about how to behave when a threat like that is on the horizon. And I do think thinking about human security and the Afghans who invested in this enterprise with us over the last 10 years, prioritizing one's friends and just conducting a policy based on human decency is a good place to start. And even now, it's hard for us with our politics around immigration and visas and our security fears. But even if this turns and the Pakistanis are wrong and the timeline for the next phase of Afghan challenge is more like 2023 than 2018, the next couple of years are emerging as a really urgent period of crisis for urban Afghans. And I think we have a duty to recognize that and to be constructive. So I know that's not a very happy note to end on, but thank you.